Welcome to this general insights on, is that a terrible echo? This general insights on AI and gender bias. It's our second general insight since we launched the center. Anna and I together are co-founders of the AI Sustainability Center. And the idea with general insights is to take up different themes and topics and invite partners, other people interested in the topic to have a conversation on specific themes. So today it's AI and gender bias. And I want to say a few words about Robin Hauser, who will be our keynote speaker today. And Robin and I met actually a few years ago when I was still at Ericsson, and Robin was working on one of her films, which was called Code, Debugging the Gender Bias. And we were fortunate enough at that time to help sponsor the film from Ericsson, which went on to win several awards. And then about a year ago, I was out in the Bay Area with Robin and was there for the launch of her second film, which was Bias. And I always thought it was so interesting, the whole concept of unconscious bias. And that's what Robin had been working with and interviewing so many professionals and academics and people in the field. And then a couple of months ago, I was about to participate in a Chalmers event when they launched CHAIR, the Chalmers AI Research Center. And I thought, let me just Google her and see what she's up to. And then all of a sudden popped up her TED Talk. And now it was kind of going to the next level, which is the AI world. And I thought, wow. And so I contacted Robin. I'm like, can I just use clips from your thing and my talk at Chalmers? And so we kind of reconnected. And then Anna and I were out in the Bay Area about a month ago. We had this great dinner, and we convinced Robin to take her story here because it's, the AI puts things on a whole nother level, like it does in so many ways. The exponential benefits, exponential risk, probably exponential bias, which is what we're here to talk about. So that's a little bit of background.
Yeah, and a little bit about the center, the AI Sustainability Center. We launched in January. So we are a multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholder hub for responsible AI. And as you know, exponential values, but exponential risk. So there are ethical considerations and pitfalls that we need to identify and govern. And we work both from a theoretical and a practical perspective at the center. So with our partners, a lot of them here, we want to ensure that they sustain their ethical values and principles in their AI application and how they're spread. We help them avoid pitfalls. We make them ready for upcoming standards and regulations. And the most important thing, to create trust as a competitive edge. So at the core of our hearts and passion is tech for good, and avoid all types of discrimination. And today we focus on gender inequality. We think that AI can be a positive force to actually accelerate gender equality. But we have to lead AI and not the other way around. So it is an honor to introduce you, Robin. Robin, you are a leading voice in events, as Elaine said, and worldwide you're on the topic of diversity inclusions and also with the important ethical AI and gender equality. So let's hear from Robin, and then we'll continue with a very dynamic panel.
And,
thank you.
just one comment before you start. Just wanted to acknowledge that this event was made possible from support from Trygghetsrådet, from Google, and from Cybercom. And our Annika from Cybercom actually got pneumonia, so she won't be on the panel. But we will miss her anyway and wish she was here. So over to you, Robin.
Yes, thank you very much. First, I just wanted to say I am so honored to be back in Stockholm. I've been on the road for 15 days. I was in London, and then I was in Brussels. So if my voice is a little scratchy, that's why. But I love Stockholm. I was here last September, and I'm just so happy to be back. You have a beautiful city. I also want to say that I am not an expert on AI. I'm a filmmaker. And as a documentary filmmaker, what we do is we dive deep into projects, and we study a certain concept or a certain theme for maybe 2 or 3 years, and then we move on to a next one, or maybe that evolves into a next documentary film. But as Elaine and Anna said, I did make a film called Bias. The subtitle was "If You're Human, You're Biased, Now What?" This came to me as an idea for a film about unconscious bias. I didn't want to name it Unconscious Bias because if your film title starts with a U, you're going to be very far down on, Amazon or Netflix or anything. So I named it Bias. But it came from really discussions. I took my film Code Debugging the Gender Gap, which was a film that I honestly thought would stay only in Silicon Valley. That film was about the gender gap and the racial gap in tech in the United States. But it turns out now, 5 years later, that film has been to 84 countries. We have subtitled it in 14 different languages. At this point, it's probably been to countries I don't even know. It's off in distribution. But what that made us realize was that we hit upon subjects that women and people of color face, not just in tech, but across all industries. And I began to hear this term unconscious bias. We began to hear it a lot during the recent election, and even, I was going to say our president, but I'll say the president of the United States was also, mentioning unconscious bias. So I began to think, what is this? Is it just me that doesn't really understand what unconscious bias is? So we're going to start with a riddle. See if you can follow this. I know the light's a little hard here, but see if you can follow this and see if you can solve this riddle. Now, I want to say that Sweden is a very progressive country, and so I think when it comes to gender, probably most of you understood this. But just be honest, did anybody not think that the surgeon could be a mother? Yeah. So this has been out now for a while, but several people have said that they were caught in this. I even had somebody come to me and tell me that their own mother is a doctor, and they got trumped with this. So what's fascinating about that is that, again, every one of us understands logically that a woman can be a doctor. But when we hear the word surgeon, our implicit association goes to male. So I wanted to know, again, if I was the only one that was caught in something like this. And I thought, well, let's just go out on the street and really any place that we were filming in the United States, and let's just ask people what unconscious bias is and see what they say.
All right, people on the street, take one.
What is unconscious bias?
Ooh. Don't know.
Unconscious bias.
I have no idea.
I think it's something ingrained in the back of your head that you don't know that you're biased about.
Unconscious bias is something which you're taught when you're really, really young and it just sticks in your mind and you grow up with these thoughts.
Bias is when you have like a preconceived notion about somebody or something based on things you've been told or seen growing up.
I feel like everyone has a bias, no matter skin color or, nationality or religious background.
What are some of your biases?
Oh no, that I can't discuss. I don't know.
So what was most interesting to me is that almost everybody I asked, what is unconscious bias? And then I'd say, well, are you biased? 99% of people, this woman was honest somewhat. Oh, I can't discuss them. But most people said, no, I'm open-minded. I work very hard at being open-minded. This is something that's important to me. And I said, okay, what about your friends and family? Are they biased? Oh, yes. Oh, yes. My mother, So fascinating. And what I learned through interviewing a man named David Rock from the Neurological Institute is that just like you can't do 2 math problems in your head at one time, we cannot see biases in us, our unconscious biases. We don't have the ability to do that, which is a very dangerous thing. So I began to think, okay, if humans are always going to be biased, if all of us have unconscious biases, and we can't just turn them off, then maybe artificial intelligence is the answer, right? Now, at first, not being an AI expert, this made perfect sense to me. I thought, okay, computers aren't human, machines don't have actual brains. But of course, what I learned, and what is well publicized now, is that AI is already becoming biased in many cases. There are some main ways that artificial intelligence is biased. One is through malicious intent, right? When somebody, a troll or somebody, deliberately gets in and hacks and makes an application or a platform biased. Next is a programmer's personal bias. Even somebody well-intended, their implicit bias can be programmed right into things based on assumptions that they're making, based on data they choose, right? Using skewed or inaccurate data. Very often we use historical data when we're writing algorithms. And this historical data can be tainted, skewed, or biased. And then through word embedding, right? So when a computer is taught to make associations of one word with other words, again, that's bringing in sort of societal norms and pattern matching. So an example of malicious intent would be Tay, Microsoft's Tay. Does anybody remember Tay or know about it? It was a chatbot that Microsoft developed to sort of emulate teen Twitter speak. And the idea was that teens could chat back and forth and say sort of completely innocuous things like, can I just say that I'm stoked to meet you? Humans are super cool. And in fact, within 16 hours, Tay was saying things like this. Okay? Hitler did nothing wrong. And worse, things I can't even put up here. So how did that happen? Microsoft says that they tested this product in China, which in itself brings in a whole different sort of bias. But what they did was they didn't design Tay to be human-proof. So they didn't account for malicious intent. Again, not necessarily intentional by the developers, by the designers, but this is a way that if you're not careful, if you don't make something human-proof, this can happen. So as I said, well-intended engineers, but who have bias, because we all do, can make bias algorithms. So when Silicon Valley looks like this, and when the majority of Silicon Valley is white, male, and young, then it's inevitable that their political views, their background, their thoughts are going to get into programming, right? And so it's very hard if you don't have diversity on this level, gender diversity, racial diversity, age diversity, to make sure that you don't have implicit bias working its way in. The other problem, of course, is data sets, because there's no governance or oversight into the data sets that we're using. Here's Jerry Kang, he's from UCLA. I interviewed him for the film, and he explains problems with bad data sets.
A lot of artificial intelligence isn't literally programmed like if-then, if you see a person named John, then give him 5 months. It's actually built up by actually training on a very large data set. So you're just feeding a smart computer lots of examples. And by looking at the examples, it learns patterns and weightings, and that's how it develops its algorithm. It's deep learning. So in some sense, human beings didn't even program the artificial intelligence. They gave it just patterns to learn, and then it started learning by itself. But then this is where the other problem comes in. Garbage in, garbage out. What we give to the computer might describe the world. But if we describe the world as an unfair world, because it is an unfair world, the computer will think an unfair world is in fact the right answer.
Interesting, right? Okay, so here's an example of that. Apologies to Google, who's here. I'm just gonna give an example. But if I type the word grandma in and do an image search, these are the images that I see. If any one of you were to pull up your computer and Google the word grandma, these are the images you'd see. Now in Stockholm, in Sweden, in Scandinavia, this is probably what some grandmothers look like, right? Older, white women. But this is absolutely not representative, certainly, of what grandmas look like the world over. And what's fascinating is that this is not just this. I did this search in the United States. I was lecturing in Bahrain, in the Middle East, the Near East, and I asked these college students to pull out their computers and in Arabic do a Google image search for grandmother. The same images came up. I said, does anybody in the room see somebody that looks like their grandmother? None of them could raise their hand. Okay, now what's dangerous is that if this data is training an algorithm, training an AI tool to make decisions about grandmothers on a global basis, then the data is skewed, so the results are going to be skewed. And you think about the ramifications of that if you start thinking about healthcare, for example. Artificial intelligence also perpetuates societal bias. So through word embedding, I explained already that it's when computer teaches, you have a word and you're basically drawing associations between other words. So here's an example. If I took a gender-neutral language like Finnish, and I typed in, the doctor cared for its patient, the automatic translation is the doctor cared for his patient. So Google Translate in this case made the assumption that the doctor was male. Now again, not intentionally biased, right? Google is not intentionally biased, but the algorithm and the machine works with word embedding, so it's taught to make associations, and most often in the world, the word doctor is associated with male pronouns. And so that's what it does. Now, of course, the same thing happens if I go to nurse. The nurse cared for its patient. The translation goes to the nurse cared for her patient. Now, this might not be life or death, but my big question about that is, do we want our artificial intelligence and our searches to be, do we want the outcome to be the world as it is now, sort of an unfair world, as Jerry Kang says, or do we want it to represent an ideal world where we want to go? But that will perpetuate gender bias, obviously. Okay, Amazon recently came out with a tool. Now, they were the first to admit that it went wrong, but because they get so many applications for jobs, that they had this hiring tool that they thought would help them. And they used pattern matching. They said, okay, let's look at our best employees across the board, our absolute best employees, and let's pattern match resumes that are coming in so that we can just sift through more easily and find our best candidates. Well, what happened, unfortunately, is because at Amazon, just like many tech companies, your average, or not your average, but some of your top employees are male. What happened was, anytime you had a resume that might have even just said women's varsity soccer, women's debate team, if the word women's or woman's was in your resume, this hiring tool from Amazon automatically spit it out. If you went to a school like Smith's College, it's an all-woman school. It didn't match enough with people that they already had working there, so it spit it out. So when they realized, wait, why aren't we getting more women applicants? It's because of this. You've also probably all heard about facial recognition software being racist and sexist. pretty much all facial recognition at this point has a very difficult time recognizing women's faces over men's, but colored faces over dark-skinned faces over light-skinned faces. So dark-skinned women are at a particularly difficult place. What's happening is that these AI tools are being used more and more often to make decisions in our society. So these tools are misidentifying innocent people as criminals. There was an ACLU study recently, it was, again, sorry Amazon, but an Amazon tool that misidentified 28 members of the US Congress as criminals, right? And they were mainly people with dark skin. Did you hear about the tool that misidentified 2 African Americans as gorillas? That happened probably over a year now. But for a while, that issue was so complicated that instead of they were trying to fix it, but they actually had to just take the whole thing off. So if you're in Google Images and you were searching for gorilla, they said, sorry, we can't help you with this. That we have no images of chimpanzees, monkeys, gorillas, because they were so afraid of making the mistake, which shows that once the mistake happened, they couldn't find an easy fix. And it's because of the lack of diverse data sets. They didn't test it on enough dark-skinned faces to make it work. You can also imagine if you're dark-skinned and if you're a woman, in this case, with facial recognition, and the increase in our movement toward automated automobiles, cars. Imagine if they can't see a dark-skinned woman walking across the street. So there's a lot of bias in predictive algorithms, both gender and racial. I always feel like I need to talk about race as much as I do gender. If you are applying for a job interview, a mortgage, a car loan, even in the United States, if you're applying to university, predictive algorithms are being used to make these decisions. Okay? Now, most predictive algorithms are black boxes, which means that they don't disclose to you what data they're using. But very often, you can't say race because that would be unethical. Very often, you're going to, in a situation like this, they will use zip codes, okay? Now, or any sort of a code that determines more or less the area in which you live. Now, in the United States, probably here as well, in which fairly segregated society, you can determine very easily somebody's socioeconomic worth and somebody's race based on where they live, okay? So what's happening is that, I jumped ahead, let me just go back to this for a minute. So what happens is that if you're turned down from a bank loan, it might not have anything to do with you as an individual, right? It might not have to do with the fact that your job, your amount of education, your salary, or where you live. It might have to do with exactly that. Something like, oh, you're a woman, you live in this neighborhood. Typically, women from that neighborhood don't repay loans as much, or a man for that matter. And therefore, you're turned down. So you're turned down for this loan, not as an individual, but because they're making assumptions about you based on historical data. To me, I find this really pretty frightening. There are numerous artificial intelligence tools that are being used right now in the courtrooms. I don't know if you can see, but behind that there are 2 dark faces, white face and a black face. So judges are using, judges are using predictive algorithms to aid in their decision-making about whether to incarcerate somebody, how long they should stay in jail. They're trying to predict recidivism. Now, in order to do this, they're looking at past cases. So in the United States, a black man is incarcerated 5 times the rate of a white man for the same crime. Historically, that's the type of court system that we have. So if they're using historical data, then they're just perpetuating racial bias in the United States. All of this to say that we need a code of ethics. Somehow we need to have some sort of oversight. I am not, being American probably, I am not a big government believer, but I'm telling you I'm beginning to change when it comes to this. We need to have some sort of governance or oversight in data input, in the products that we're creating. We're on such the bleeding edge of technology right now that there's this huge rush to get the new product out quickly. They might have tested it in China. They might have tested it in Pittsburgh. And if they come up with an 80% success rate, great. But that 20% are the ones that are getting hit in the crosswalk, right, by automated cars, or being called a gorilla when you're a person, a human. This is interesting. Some ethical issues, I think, especially around artificial intelligence for profit, right? Target marketing that's beginning to happen to adolescents, for example. So Facebook is using artificial intelligence to predict future behavior of all of us that use Facebook. And they're selling this information to advertisers. So personal ad, think about this. Think about if we have a big problem with obesity in the United States, right? With diabetes. And yet Facebook is sharing data with Amazon, who now has Whole Foods, who now is sharing with Starbucks. So when they start target marketing your children at 4 o'clock in the afternoon saying, you need sugar, you want sugar. Or what about if somebody's a gambler or a smoker, right? They know, they're aware of our weaknesses, and they're target advertising to all of us. I'm sure you've had it where you buy a pair of shoes on one completely separate app, and the next thing you know, you're reading an article in the newspaper, digitally on the newspaper, and there comes an advertisement for shoes. They're all sharing data. Again, what are the ethics of this? So we talked a little bit about decisions making, driverless cars. But this is also an ethical issue. So driverless cars have to start making a decision. If there's going to be an accident, do you hit the car in front of you, or do you swerve off and hit a bystander on the street, or even, a dog on the street? Who makes those decisions? And what about healthcare? Okay, AI in medicine has a completely separate problem. But when you think about the fact that even a normal medicine bottle will give you a dosage, not for man versus woman, but for child versus adult. And when you think about that, it doesn't make a lot of sense, because women typically weigh a lot less, have different chemistry makeup than a man. We should not be taking the same dosage. But that's just on the basic non-AI level, right? But when it comes to AI, you hear about things often that they'll do. If you're a woman, they often believe that, if African American women, they believe can handle more pain, so they subconsciously subscribe less pain medication. In a woman, they believe, especially if you're a well-fit woman, you're less likely to have a heart attack. So it's the last thing that they actually look for. And they're using these predictive algorithms to determine what you might have. And it is, if you're a woman who's maybe 50 years old and you look fairly fit, it's not going to come up and say, they enter body weight and everything, it's not going to come up and say heart attack. But women's heart issues is one of the biggest killers. So profit-driven tools in private healthcare, you're lucky not to have this issue. How will the algorithm make these decisions? Right? Tools in healthcare are being used more and more. Are they going to start making suggestions toward people that can actually pay for private healthcare versus those that can't? This is a really big issue, especially in the United States. Will AI recommend treatment based on whether the patient is deemed to be able to repay it? So solutions. Do we have any? I think we need oversight, which is what I said before. I'm grateful for organizations like the AI Sustainability Center for bringing up these issues. I will tell you that I'm heartened by the fact that companies like Microsoft, IBM, Google are paying a lot of attention to this, even Facebook. They care about this, they know about these issues, they're working on it. But the frightening thing is that once biased data gets into artificial intelligence and gets into word embedding, and not even word embedding, deep learning, so one algorithm's teaching another algorithm, which is informing another algorithm, how do you get that data out? And can a computer ever really forget something? I was speaking in September at a company here in Stockholm, and the data scientists told me that this was a bank, and they said, it was fascinating because one of their tools, artificial intelligent tools, kept telling them that the more characters in the last name of the person meant they had a higher chance that they wouldn't repay a loan. And they thought, this is strange. Why is this? And at first they spit it out, and the computer kept coming back telling them this was true, this was true. Well, when they said, well, okay, that's easy, we could just use that. We could just use that and say, if you have more than 13 characters in your last name, we won't give you a loan. And then they got to the bottom of it, and they learned that that actually was attached to ethnicity, and that most immigrants into Sweden have longer last names. So then you're stuck with a moral, ethical issue. Can you unifiably not allow loans, not give loans to somebody because they're an immigrant? Is that ethical? Is that fair? My small little answer to this was to make a film about it. The film, again, was about unconscious bias. I'm going to show you just a trailer, just to end the talk with that. Again, the film's called Bias. It's not out there right now. I'm doing private screenings at companies and conferences, and I'm traveling sort of the world right now with this film. It just got off the film festival circuit.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias, which means unconscious bias.
What is unconscious bias?
All of the horrible things that we do to each other that we pretend we don't do.
I feel like everyone has a bias, no matter skin color.
There are countless biases that affect all of us. I wanted to explore unconscious bias and how it relates to gender and race. Where does it come from? What is its impact? And is there anything we can do to change it?
We evolved over millions of years to have the kind of brains that we have today. To be suspicious of people who are different from us, we should ask ourselves, is that useful in the modern world?
You as a neighbor on Nextdoor don't create one of these posts thinking, I'm about to stereotype an entire race.
I would like to not have to scan my neighborhood for who's watching me and thinking I'm a threat.
Your data suggests a moderate automatic association for harmless objects with white Americans and weapons with black Americans.
Objective quantitative studies show that men and women both perceive women different and lesser.
The news about toxic culture, workplaces saturated with sexual harassment and pay inequality, is relentless.
I have this sense that if I fail, it'll be like, well, you see, this is why we don't invest in women.
When you're standing across the table from the people who are writing your checks telling you that you don't deserve this, that's hard because you're literally putting your body on the line.
Bias at its core is a survival heuristic. You can have that gut feeling. It just has to be based on something that actually matters.
We tend to think about our own behavior as somehow more fair and free of bias than it is.
We're concerned about bias being introduced into AI. It's already there because we're the one teaching AI.
Trying to understand what is at the base of some of my perceptions and judgments, that's what led me on this journey.
Yeah. So, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Robin. You will come back just in a couple of minutes to moderate the panel. But first, reversing the tech conference trend of only one
women in the panel on stage. I will introduce the only man today at stage, and he will open up the discussion. That's Lennart Hedström, CEO of Trygghetsrådet.
Job and a new career after being laid off. We also help the companies to work without placement and to recruit new talents. There are definitely preconceptions and hidden agendas when people or companies are going to recruit. Candidate selections based on preferred age, gender, or origin is not uncommon. But we can also see that the preconceptions are changing to the better. And with new tools and with new technologies, competence-based recruitment can be more innovate, increase diversity, and have more of new career opportunities. The discussion today will handle about gender bias in the labor market and the future of work. AI will improve our lives, but there are some concerns whether the soft learning technology, depending on historical data, will create gender biases. TRR's vision is we open doors to the work life in the future. We like to make an impact and influence to the Swedish labor market to make it more dynamic and to increase mobility. And more competence-based recruitment and more unbiased recruitment is, of course, a very important issue for us in our ambition to reduce the time between two jobs for all of our candidates. I'm excited to listen to the panel discussion, and let me introduce the persons. It's Lena Ag, General Director of the Swedish Gender Equality Agency. It's Sara Övreby, Public Policy and Government Relations Manager at Google. Tonima Afroze, Software Engineer at Klarna. And it's also Anna Berggren, our brilliant CIO from TRR. And everything will be moderated by Robin Hauser. Thank you.
Okay, yes, thank you very much, Lennart, for that introduction. And I did also forget to say that, yes, I too believe that AI will lead us into a better future. I am not completely against AI. In fact, I'm not really against it at all. I believe that it will help us with aviation, navigation, healthcare, in many ways. So we just have to keep a close eye on it. Lena, tell me, coming from a public agency and the government, what role can standards and regulations and government policies play in shaping a more fair environment?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for an interesting lecture or whatever speech that you held here. I must say, as you, I am not an expert on AI. But I'm very interested, and that's why I came here. I really wanted to listen and learn, and I think it's an extremely important conversation to have and to kick off that conversation now. Of course, public agencies and government have a very, very important role to play in regulating and in trying to, my first thought when I saw this is, okay, we need now gender mainstreaming of AI, because that is, from a Swedish perspective, a strategy that we have used for many years, and we have done so within, government offices. We have done so in Swedish agencies and in Swedish municipalities for a long time. So we know that it works. And of course, the first thing we need to do is to put up goals and to follow up on the goals, and we need a commitment from the top. That's basics when it comes to promoting gender equality within organizations. And you need to you need to have the same perspectives here. So let me give you an interesting example from the Swedish Defense Recruitment Agency. They put up ambitious goals to bring in more women into basic education for military service. And so they went in to see how did they do the recruitment, what standards and criteria were they using. And by doing this, going into detail and analyzing it with a gendered lens, putting on the gender glasses, they were able in 1 year, in the Navy, they were able to enhance women's participation from 17 to 37% in 1 year. And for the Air Force, for the military education, from 31 to 54%. So we know that putting on this gendered lens and actually making it work and going into and analyze, and have a gender analysis, it actually gives results. And very often it also improves, for instance, for municipalities, services that includes many more people. So that's the short answer. We can come back later on, but...
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think that success has been fabulous. Will it work with data as well?
Yes, of course. It works on anything, of course. I think you proved that yourself. You can put a gender perspective on building roads, and you can put gender perspectives on data, of course.
What do you think about that?
Thanks also for having me here at the panel. I think absolutely you should put this lens also on the data. From Google's perspective, we see the use of AI as you have noted, all of the speakers here, that this brings enormous potential to humanity, enormous potential in order to solve the challenges that we are facing both on a local, regional, and a global level. But to get it right, we need to make sure that the data that we use and the algorithms that we apply give us the results that we would like. AI is not, or technology as such, is not a holy ghost or a ghost that goes around doing whatever it likes. It should be accountable to humans. It should be accountable to us and our intentions with the technology so that it's used for good. And Google both has general principles on how we want AI to be used, making sure that we have a that is socially beneficial, that it doesn't create or reinforce unfair bias. We want it to be accountable to people, as I said, to make sure that we do get things right. But we also have challenges in the sense that the data that we have, as you showed by searching for images on grandmothers, that the data that we have are today showcasing an unfair world. And that's something that we work on and that we need to work on even more. But we have, in addition to the principles, we have processes to make sure that we increase the awareness, both internally and externally, and also work proactively and actively to change the challenges that we see.
Tonima, is it that easy? When the majority of programmers are men, and I'm not saying that men can't be, fans and supporters of women, allies to women, but is it that easy? How do we ensure that the data input is fair and accurate?
Right, it's really not that easy, of course. I mean, it's not that all men are sexist and all tech men are sexist, that's not it. But creators of tech tend to be the ones who set the standards. So if I'm creating a software system, I will test it on myself while I'm developing. So if we have a lot of perspectives from the beginning, we can avoid a lot of the problems with bias that we get further down the line. And then other than that, of course, we need to think about what data we are using. We could say, okay, let's just remove the gender attribute from our data set so we don't collect that. But then, of course, it can be inferred by what job we have, for example, or what kind of things we're buying online. So it's very difficult, and it's important to test in different ways, to test on different populations, to see if we're getting these kinds of bias.
I have another question for you. Is it possible, in the example I gave about the characters, for example, and understanding that related to a certain socioeconomic group or a certain population, is it possible for artificial intelligence to forget something? Can you teach it to unlearn?
Interesting. I think once you have something in your learning, it's hard to get rid of.
Which creates its own set of problems. Anna, tell me a little bit about TRR. How does TRR see the future of work from a recruitment point of view? And is there a risk that hiring algorithms, as we saw, proliferate what happened with, example, the Amazon case, as I showed you here, where women are sort of being marginalized, or in that case, unintentionally ejected?
Exactly. Well, the answer is obviously yes. The future work is already here, and we are very keen on making a stand to make sure that we don't only focus on technology, user experience, and gain more money, and all the services that we want to provide. So we were discussing that, me and Anna and Elaine, last Friday, and we need to make sure that we consider the ethical perspective as well as the culture and leadership perspective as well. What we did was that we were included in a project with unbiased recruitment, a collaboration with TNG and Furhat Robotics. And what we did was that our clients were using this robot and gave input to the development. And they had the chance to change the algorithms based on what clients' input, and also secure the ethical perspective. I believe that it's very important that not only engineers take a stand in this question, right? I would like to say that, as you said, the bleeding edge of technology. When are we in bleeding edge on ethics? Right? We need to combine those two, and that's why I think it's important, like me as a CIO, to take a stand and also discuss those questions, because as Tonima says, it's hard to forget the things that we teach the system.
Can I say something
Please.
also? I think all of you touched upon, sort of the problems and how difficult it is to kind of roll back something that is already out there. So what we need to see is a chain of actions. And of course, one important issue is to promote gender equality in the tech industry, but also in tech educations. So more women and diversity in the tech education, and that's from a Swedish perspective, of course. And I think that is also very important to kind of acknowledge that you need to do many things at the same time with this perspective, in front of your eyes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I believe that obviously having more women engineers, for example, will probably help at least catch if something seems to be. The problem is we can never represent all of diversity in the coding room, right? And so it's difficult. Yes, Sara?
No, but just for any company, or at least any self-aware company, you realize that for your long-term long-term success, you need, as Tonima says, you need to have a very diverse and inclusive workforce. That's where your path to success or failure starts. Because you can't, as Google says, we want to build for all, we want to code for all, we have 7 products with 1 billion users all over the world, and they're not Silicon Valley looking, all of those 1 billion users. So starting at your core, at your workforce, you need to make sure that you have a diverse and inclusive workforce. And then also, as you said, you can't take account for everything in the coding room, but that means that you have to be very aware of the collaboration and cross-functional work across the company to make sure that you involve others than the software engineers or the engineers in your processes, in your product launches and your building products. So I think you have a lot to do. Of course, everyone has a lot to do internally, and we are highly aware and working very hard on this topic, but we are not anywhere close to reaching a perfect level, so to speak, and I don't know if we're ever going to be. But doing that is one start, and also making it business critical, because otherwise it gets a project that is forgotten somehow.
I'm going to go to Anna and then Tonima.
Yeah. Also, when we discuss this, we also need to understand if we want to reduce the risk we have. We just released a report from TRR showing that there are so many new professional roles that we need to have in our companies to make sure that if we discuss intended pitfalls, for instance, misuse, overuse, and etc., So we really need to have that competence and skills within our companies as we speak, and we're in a hurry. So we need to make sure that the competence gap is reduced.
Exactly.
I agree with what the previous speaker says, that it's not just the engineer's responsibility. I mean, ethics is not a new topic. So we need to involve social scientists who have been dealing with ethics for a long time. Because in tech and AI, we've sort of been moved into this area because of the implications. And then other than analyzing the systems we're creating, we can also, while building, look at what we're doing. So me, for example, as a software engineer at Klarna, I work with credit risk and fraud detection, which we do in real time when a user tries to make a purchase. And for my dissertation at the University of Oxford, I studied these credit risk models, and I wanted to know, do we have any biases, and what can we do to unbias them? So that means looking at mathematical definitions of bias and what actually applies to our scenario, and then the data we are getting in, the data we are getting out, doing statistical analyses, and then based on the results, seeing if we need to adjust anything.
So do you have a solution, an easy solution in terms of how we can at least try to, because some of these examples that I gave, even just the translation, like with word embedding, you understand what the computer's doing. It has to go with what's most commonly associated with certain words, right? But how do we prevent that type of thing from happening?
So as you said, data. Having a large and representative data set from the beginning, and then doing this as a continuous process. It's never enough to say, okay, we are bias-free now, and let it go, because we will always find new possibilities and new groups of people. So that's an important work.
Yeah. Well, you know, frankly, I think we need some kind of framework, you know, for all of us to hold on to a certain extent. And since I'm representing a government agency here, I have to tell you that the Swedish government have adopted a digital strategy for sustainable digital transformation in Sweden. It was adopted in 2017. And the aim of this policy is to contribute to competitiveness, to full employment, and to sustainability from an economical, social, and environmental point of view. And of course, AI is also part of this strategy. And we even have a new government agency for digitalization in Sweden. And of course, gender equality is mentioned in this strategy. But you know, I also have to say that it's just in the very beginning. And I hope that, you know, I know that there are a number of government agencies, you know, working on these issues, but I I have a little clue that we need to push more for, gender equality perspectives to be included, even in Sweden.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right, because often what I see is that even though, say, if you call it diversity and inclusion or ethical standards of what, those tend to be the small groups or the departments that aren't funded as much, right?
Exactly.
That aren't necessarily taken as seriously. Exactly. Sarah, do you have something?
No, I just agree with them.
Yeah.
You have to make it business critical. You have to make it like for your long-term competitiveness, make sure. And I also think
you have to make a business case.
Exactly,
out of it.
and you have to with regards to AI, we need to democratize AI. We need to get more people involved in the discussions and not thinking that this is something that is too hard to grasp or something that I can't get involved with, but rather encourage more people to get into the discussions, to be aware of the technology and what the potential is and what the challenges are, so that we can discuss this together.
Yes, and you said yourself that you're not against AI. I mean, I think no one is, because we understand that it can do a lot of good. But already today we see, it's problematic with the digitalization, because it has actually turned into a real problem when it comes to men's violence against women, because many shelters and safe houses today in Sweden experience this problem because there are tracking devices into women, in women's phones, maybe not intended to follow women, maybe intended for other purposes, but it becomes a real problem for these women because these violent men can actually find them very easy. So there are problems, but there are opportunities as well, and we just need to be aware of them.
I just want to get a sense of how many questions there are out in the audience. Just a few. Okay, I'll ask one last question, then we'll turn to the rest of you can be thinking of questions. So governance or ethical oversight, what does that look like? Is it communal? Is it by country? Is it global? I mean, how do we really...
It's all of those things.
It's all of those things. I mean, and how do we standardize them?
Yeah.
I think we of course have a very high bar for our internal ethical surveillance or ethical framework for AI at Google, but we also take part in various forms of discussions and governance, as you described. We do partnership for AI with other companies. We do take part in the policy dialogues in both Europe, in the US, and in the East and Africa. We also invest globally in AI development centers across the world as one way of mitigating bias risks, being sure that we work across the globe to get everyone into the data, as Tonima has agreed. But we also work with the standards, of course, with the Standards Institute in Sweden and ISO globally. So I think you have to do this in all the in the various forms, and we're also very much looking forward to the Swedish government getting to their next steps with regards to the strategies and getting more into action on what we can concretely do. So I think you should work on every level.
The EU recently launched a directive for ethical AI, and the US also something similar. So we should look at those kinds of things for help in all organizations working with AI.
Yeah, because after all, these applications aren't, even if they were developed in Silicon Valley or if they were developed here in Stockholm, they're used by, they don't have boundaries and borders, right? They're used all over the world.
But I really believe both perspectives are, of course, important, but we really need to understand that this is also a management question within a company and board question, and we need to make sure that the boards are, educated to discuss this type of questions and not targeting only user experience technology, because we're going to lose in the long run if we don't handle both perspectives. And that we must make it stick, so to speak, and have assessment models. And there are so many different organizations out there now, and we need to make sure that we collaborate.
There was a question back here. Yeah. You need to go. Okay.
No.
Yeah. Do you want me to just... right before your question, I just want to say thank you to Lena. Unfortunately, she has a previous commitment, but thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, and this was really interesting.
Thank you for being here.
Yes, thanks.
Okay, yep. So I'll give my layperson's perspective, and then I'm going to turn it over to Tonima to answer this. But when you see pictures on the internet, the first simple answer is everybody's collecting data. Everybody. Every app that you do, every time you even buy like a ticket to take the train, I mean, all of this data is it's big data. It's all being collected. When you see images on the internet, that's because those are the images we're putting on. And our responsibility, every one of us, is not necessarily to think about whether or not we're representing the minorities when we're posting pictures or say to the internet. So of course that's the majority that is ruling in that case. It's the majority of people are white, and therefore or at least in the countries that tend to be posting pictures of their grandmothers or of themselves, right?
Also, I mean, when we try and make algorithms learn from pictures, there are some data sets that are commonly used with a lot, because you need, millions of pictures. And some of those big data sets contain very few images of colored people. So for example, the case of Google that tagged 2 black friends as gorillas might have been using one of these enormous data sets where a very small percentage of those were black people. So it's really not that they are trying to be unbiased, or biased, but there should have been more of each group to be represented from the start. And your other question was about unlearning learned biases. So yes, you can scrap and relearn, but the point normally with machine learning, which you base AI on, is that it gets better over time. You create an initial state with lots of data, and then you add more and more along the way, and it learns new things and becomes even better. But then, of course, yes, you can try to unbias it by giving it more data of a certain type. For word embeddings, for example, where a doctor is linked to a man and nurse is linked to a woman, there are some algorithms being developed to remove that specific type of word embeddings. So there are some technical measures you can take.
Practically, we work with that with Google Translate, for example. You mentioned an example of with translating between English and Finnish. So this was done in Turkish, between Turkish and because it's similar. Exactly. Yeah. So then we work specifically on that challenge and reverse the outcome of that. So it's possible to change, but you need to become conscious of the challenges, and then you have to work proactively to correct it.
And through deep learning, the data, and when an algorithm learns and becomes better, and when it learns something, and then it sort of informs what it's learned to new algorithms. And so those data sets, or that one piece of data, gets so deeply embedded, right, into systems, and it's also distributed. So it's very difficult to extract bad data, right? You can take out an algorithm, you can scrape that, but to scrape information, is anybody here from IBM? So Watson was, I call it a supercomputer, and they don't like that. So whatever it is, it's a very smart computer. And they decided the handlers of Watson decided to let it ingest or read the Urban Dictionary. Now, the Urban Dictionary has all sorts of colloquial words and slang, and they were surprised when Watson began to swear. It began to speak with profanity. And I mean, how could they be surprised by that? Because they're the ones that allowed it to ingest that information. So even when they went, let's undo that, let's scrape it, because Watson knew what the words meant, but didn't know when it was appropriate or ethical or, proper to use those words. And they had a very difficult time scraping all that, because the certain words had then suddenly been understood and been learned that it could be used in multiple different ways to substitute for other words. It's pretty funny. Other questions? Yes. Thank you, Elaine.
It's kind of a setup. So I want to ask Anna, because when we met on Friday, and you held up the report, but you didn't say what the rules were, the future rules. And I think it would be interesting if you say what you think.
Unfortunately, it's only in Swedish, so we'll say it in Swedish. but there are, for instance, a role called molnvakt. And that is a professional role that are going to make sure that we consider the ethics when we work with algorithms, etc. We also have, it's 8 different professional roles. We also have the climate accountant. So we have the report on the piano, I believe. And please grab one and read about it. And I believe that we need to take action on these roles to make sure we get a sustainable transformation. Thank you.
Yes.
I think that the...
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, the question was with Google established an AI advisory board or like an ethical council for AI that was dismissed after just 1 week of functioning. And the reason for that was that we didn't get it right, to be blunt. We didn't get the mix of people right, and we didn't get the format right. So we are going back to the drawing desk and looking into how we can remake it, because I think the function, the thought function was a good idea and a usable thing, but as it didn't get right, it wouldn't be able to function properly, and then we need to reconsider how we can make it right for the next time, so to speak. So to be continued. But I think for companies in the beginning of their journey, I think we've, just from our perspective, we published our principles, we published ideas on processes, we've making available both advice with regards to development processes, but also internal cross-functional processes. So I think there is a lot of companies doing their own work that share widely also to peers. So I think you could have a good guidance from both the good and the mistakes that we've done online.
Isn't it a challenge sometimes when you add a board or you add a group or team responsible for this question? Because the balance is that I really need everyone to be committed. So you don't, delegate or abdicate from the question. And that is what we're trying to do internally now. We need to make sure that everyone is involved in this really essential question for our future. Not get rid of it or delegate it to someone else. I think that is a challenge today.
No, and internally, AI is part of all Google's products today.
Yeah,
so AI is at the core of our business. So it is not delegated to a specific board. That was more to give both external overview and more deeper insight into how we work with it, but also to give other perspectives to the work that we do. So I think that we need to reconstitute that.
Any other question there? You're absolutely right, which is why I posed the question earlier. Is this clearly it's a global issue, and how do we account for that? Do we need a sort of, United Nations of ethics in AI? I think we do. I think we do, and I absolutely agree that it's a huge concern, because I don't know that we can always just. I don't know. Those that are data scientists would know this better, but I don't believe that we can scrub it down to say that we only want to look at data that comes from sources that we trust. No. Right? It all probably gets mixed in and together. So, unfortunately, right now, I would say just don't necessarily trust all the data that you get without looking carefully at that data set.
No, I think that from a governance perspective, for example, with GDPR in Europe, it's important that we regulate the sector or the data or the AI in a way that continues to allow for innovation. But also when you do have a regulation in place, for example, GDPR, which is unique for Europe, that we suggested that maybe the US could introduce as well, but that is not under discussion in China, for example, that you make it to become a way to use more data safer, that you don't make it to hamper innovation or hamper the use of data, but to make use of it in a safer way. So it's very important where you strike the balance, but having the higher principles or the more moral view of things should be a good thing in the long run.
Great. Good. Okay, I think that is it for our discussion, for our panel. Again, thanks to Lane and Anna, and I'll let them thank you very much to the panelists. Really appreciate your being here.